Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am the world's most okayest historian and the host of this show, Nick Schweitzer. Yes, I'm aware that today, no, Nick, it's not Friday. It is Thursday. Well, it's just a precursor, right? I have a child that plays the lovely sport of ice hockey, and it's the end of the year tournament this weekend. And if there are any of parents out there or former players out there listening to the show, then you know that that means that my Friday from Sunday, I will be living, breathing, eating, and everything in between ice hockey. There's nothing else going on this weekend. So, with that being said, I will not be able to put an episode out tomorrow. So, I am putting it out tonight. So, it's one day early. Anyway, in our last episode, which has done phenomenally well, as I may say, and this appears to be a topic that you individuals like. Sounds like something you all want to hear about. So let's get us all somewhere up to speed on the situation that we ended with, right? So the United Kingdom is in early, or in late summer, early autumn of 1940. And as we learned, the Nazis blitzed through basically all of mainland Europe within a year, right? So they invaded Poland. And by May, they were crumbling France, right? It is a bad situation at this point. By June, right after they knock down France, they're salivating at the idea of getting to Britain and a total all-out amphibious warfare fight. Now, I will make a quick break in this moment, as one thing we all need to remember here is while, yes, England is a country, and yes, at the point in time, they are quite literally the last line of defense for Europe at this point. But remember, right, it's the United Kingdom. And in 1940, the Commonwealth was very, very large. Not the largest it's ever been, but very large and very much ready to go and fight. Anyway, I'll digress on that, but let's keep it in mind before we go into all of this, right? That's going to be a kind of a pivotal point. But of course, before we do get to that conversation, I would just like to give a massive shout out to my friends over at Might and Fury World War II, as today, February 29th, is their official Kickstarter launch. And I look forward to hearing about their success. And I'm also excited to hear about how our listeners jumped on this fantastic opportunity to buy and play a game we can all love and care about. For some of you, that might be taking a world leader, which are the little characters that you can use. They're 3D printed, and you can totally make them however you want. You want to put Hitler in 1939, you can put Hitler in 19. You want to put Hitler in April of 1945, you want to paint him that way, you can paint him that way. You can quite literally pick and choose what moments in the war you can personalize it to the moment. Honestly, to me, on top of the fact that you're learning about not just one individual theater or one individual fight or one individual person, you are learning about it all. It's a foundational learning piece. It's fantastic. You guys should go check it out. Their Kickstarter, which is now live, you can now go back them and you can now pre-order. It'll be in the show notes. Go check it out. Now that we've gotten all that fun stuff out of the way, where exactly are we this week, right? So, as we said earlier, we are in the summer, late summer, early autumn of 1940 in England. The French have been defeated, and the Battle of Dunkirk has happened. It struck fear in the British people. It was the last line of defense for the British in mainland Europe. Now everyone's back in England. It is a bad situation, if you will. And also, through power changes and new faces, they are now led by Sir Winston Churchill, who is not just ready for a fight, he is ready to die in that fight. While there are many factors in this battle and so many different perspectives, we are going to break them down in each episode. And in this one specifically, we are going to look at the ones they deemed simply as the few. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss the trials, the tribulations, the stories of those who were a part of the Royal Air Force in their never-ending fight to protect their homeland. Into the memoirs and the memories of these men that were a part of the RAF during the Battle of Britain, I am going to be doing a large disservice to not just the subject, but to the reality of what actually took place, right? So it is important to know that while, yes, at the time of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe knew for a fact the British pilots were not a force to be played with, and along with Germany, the RAF was the largest air force in the world. But that wasn't the Luftwaffe's first concern, right? So if we are simply just taking a peep at the map and utilize what we know in regards to this time, we know two things. One, being that the Royal Air Force would be defending their own homeland from strategically placed air bases in England. Two, being the Germans would need to cross the English Channel on an attack and a retreat every single time. So the pilots not only had to make it across the channel, bomb, and fight, they would need to then head back across. And that makes the two situations drastically different, right? So even the prospect of being downed is considered two totally separate dealings. The British pilots, if successfully bailed out of their planes, would be picked up and taken right back to rejoin the fight, right? They're landing, they're over England, right? They're just going to be picked up and they're going to be turned back around. They're going to be dropped off as long as they're healthy, right? As long as they get too banged up, they're going right back up, right? Rejoin the fight, right? So if a man goes down, he's not lost. Now, if he dies, totally different story. But if they live, they can fight another day. The Germans, on the other hand, who are either crashing into the English Channel or are bailing out over Germany, are not going to get the chance to return to the cockpit and fight. Realistically, if a German pilot and or crew went down during this time, their war was over, if not their life. So they're taken out of the fight period. And that's important to remember as we kind of go through this. I know exactly what you're thinking. Well, if the Royal Air Force is playing defense, they would not chase aircraft across the channel, right? Correct. However, if there is ever one thing that Hitler simply could not beat outside of the Soviet Union, it was the sheer force and power of the largest navy on the planet, that being the Royal Navy. If you remember from our last episode, the British spared no expense on getting their nation prepared for the impending invasion. Of that plan was to park as many naval vessels as possible around England in order to protect her. This proves to be awful for the Luftwaffe because not only are they having to deal with air force that is similar, they are also now having to deal with a navy that is better. So as we dive into this episode, that while yes, the RAF gave the Luftwaffe a total ass beating of a lifetime in this moment, they were not the only ones throwing haymakers for the British in the summer of 1940. It's important to realize the Navy was there. It's important to realize that they had ground defenses for anti-aircraft. They all were a part of the fight. But that's not what this episode's about. This episode is about the Royal Air Force. And so now that that rant is done, it's time to get into some of the numbers to really draw all of this into a good perspective, a good scope, if you will. By June of 1940, the Luftwaffe had roughly 2,000 operational bombers. And for a quick comparison, the British RAF had roughly 2,600 planes total available for defense. Not fighters, total airworthy aircraft. Now, they had more, but they were not necessarily airworthy as of that point. This is just June of 1940. On the 10th of July 1940, when the Luftwaffe began officially bombing the hell out of the British homeland, and beginning their campaign, they would have roughly 1,000 bomber crews being protected by around 900 fighters. So you got 2,000 airplanes in the air just like that, right? And they're on offense. They're going for Britain. And on the other end of the channel, the Royal Air Force had around 1,250, 1,260 fighter pilots ready to defend. Now, as I'm reading through this, right, you're probably asking yourself, well, how exactly did this work for the British? Yes, being an unrelenting force and refusing to give in can certainly buy you time in the middle of a war. Not win, it can buy you time, and that is important. But being killed is being killed, right? So the macho mentality doesn't truly help in the long run. It just delays that inevitable. Well, in this case, the British were the last line of defense for the Western world. And that's kind of how the world was viewing at that point. Everybody else had fallen. England was left, right? What ends up happening is everyone pours into England to become a member of the Royal Air Force, to become a pilot. And yes, the British did call upon their Commonwealth, such as Canada, Australia, Ireland, South Africa, New Zealand, etc. There were hundreds of pilots who were now turning to the RAF in order to go to war. To touch on some of those numbers, these are rough, right? They're not exact. But 146 Poles, 135 New Zealanders, 112 Canadians, 88 Czechs, 30 Belgians, 32 Australians, 25 South Africans, 14 French, 10 Irish, 11 Americans, and many others from many different nations came to England specifically to fight against the Luftwaffe. This is unprecedented. You've gotten pilots from defeated militaries coming to finish the job. You've got pilots from neutral countries coming to get experience in combat. What I'm saying is, it is literally just a melting pot of people trying to force the Nazis to stay in mainland Europe. These men, along with those RAF pilots, would become who we now know and will learn more about in this episode simply as the few. Eric Stanley Locke was born on April 19th, 1919 in Shrewsbury, England, to a small farming family. Now, do not let this get confused with an uneducated or impoverished, as some people might think, right? So if you remember from my Zhukov series, then you will certainly understand what I mean when I say that. Now, you see, young Eric would be privately educated in what we now call the Woodard schools. Now, unlike what some of us in the United States think when we think of interwar periods, the British were recovering from the war that had ended just 6 months prior to Eric's birth. And if there's anything we learned in the previous episode, the British knew war was once again on the horizon by the 1930s. And in 1933, on Eric's 14th birthday, his father bought him a 15-minute flight with the local air circus. Right? It's like a barnstormer, a traveling air crew, right? Airplanes are still relatively new. They're a wonder. So air circuses existed. And when he was on his 14th birthday, he got to go take a ride one of them, right? That sounds like every 14-year-old's dream, right? I bet this is where his I'm gonna become, the world's greatest pilot began. Totally incorrect, right? He thought it was lame. And actually, he left school at the age of 16 in order to go work for his father. But it was in this one experience of flying that would play a massive role, not now, but 6 years down the road. As the entire world braced for war in 1939, Eric thought back on his experience in the plane and made a decision that if he was going to fight, he'd rather do it in the air. Eric Locke would graduate fighter pilot training in May of 1940, the same month that France fell. He graduates fighter pilot training. Assigned to the 41st Squadron in the northern areas of England after weeks of waiting around with only one victory so far, he was then moved again to RAF Hornchurch in Essex in September of 1940. So this is in the middle, right? The Blitz is beginning in London. The fight is on. And it is here where the fight would truly begin for the now 21-year-old pilot. As the Blitz began, as I said, Locke would tighten up his desire to kill the enemy, and on the 5th, he would shoot down two HE-111s over the Thames. As he chased one to the ground and realized a German Bf-109 had quickly moved in behind him and opened up, riddling his Spitfire and taking a round through his leg, Locke pulled back as hard as he could, sending the plane into an accelerated, unrestricted climb. For those of you that don't know, imagine going full speed and then just pulling up, right? An unrestricted climb. You are climbing as high, as fast as you possibly can. Now, let's just stop real quick. So, fast fact, yes, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was in fact a great plane. However, it was not very great at climbing, and the Spitfire was. This allowed Locke to climb fast enough that when the 109 pursued, it stalled, allowing Locke to loop in for the kill and also allowing him to track down the remaining Bf 109, and he also downed it. So within his first true day of combat over England, he has knocked down four four enemy aircraft, right? And this would not stop him, as this is a critical moment to talk about how often these RAF pilots were in the sky. In a typical squadron, which would be 12 pilots in total, they would fly an average of 40 hours every single day combined. These guys were quite literally going up, coming down, refueling, and then just repeat the cycle over and over and over and over and over again, right? So they're in the air a lot. So the prospect of taking out a large number of planes is relatively high, but so is the prospect of yourself being downed and or killed. The day following his 4-kill day, the next morning on the 6th, he would shoot down another Junkers 88, and on the 9th, he would down two more Bf 109s in a race around the skies of London as the 109s attempted to clear a path for the incoming bombers. On the 11th, again, he would take on an 88 and a 109 near Kent, where he would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. We are 6 days into this fight, and Eric Locke has downed his 11th enemy fighter. And I could sit here and talk more about how absolutely insane his flying record would become, but we would have a lot more stories to get to in this episode, so I'm going to have to kind of reel it in and just go over them rather quickly. By the official end of the Battle of Britain on October 31st, 1940, Eric Locke would become an ace 5 times over, his 21st victory coming on the 20th near Biggin Hill. Now, Eric Locke would go on to fight over France, where he would be awarded the Distinguished Service Order and knock out his 26th and final German on July 14th, 1941. And on August 3rd, while returning from a mission, he would engage a large column of German planes over France. Locke's plane was hit and was last seen breaking away from formation. Eric Locke's body or plane was never found. He was 22 years old. William Henry Millington was born on the 7th of January in 1918 in Newcastle upon Tyne. The Millingtons would not stay in England very long and would move within the Commonwealth to Edwardstown, Australia, when William was just a little boy. Now, not much is truly known about his early stages in life other than he was your usual rough and tumble kid that was not afraid of a little fight. Always fascinated by aircraft and flying, in June of 1939, he decided to head back to England in order to take a short commission as a pilot in the RAF. Now, what in the hell is a short commission? Well, it's a commission, but you're not going to be in the service for 4 or 6 years. It would more than likely be 2 or 3. It's a short-term service. That's all that means. Millington would be granted a probationary pilot a few months later, and in June of the following year, he would be assigned and graduate from training squadron in Sutton Bridge to become familiar with the Hawker Hurricane. Now, I'm sure I don't need to refresh anyone on the significance of the time in which he became a hurricane pilot, but it is the month between France falling and the Battle of Britain beginning. Still under his probationary period, William would be thrusted into the realities of war when on the 9th of July, that's right, the day prior, it's the day leading up to the Battle of Britain, uh, he would come in contact with the Bf 109 along the coast of Dover. Immediately giving chase and shooting it into the channel, Millington would earn his wings and shed the probationary status. On August 15th, after his squadron being moved to protect northern England, Millington and his co pilots would catch a pack of HE 111s moving in off the coast of Middlesbrough. Immediately and once again, Millington would scramble from their airfield in order to meet their targets head on. In an ensuing fight, Millington would get his second, third, and fourth victory over England. Millington would continue to go on the hunt. On the 30th, he would down 2 more aircraft, and on the following day, he would claim 3 more victories and a damaged fourth. Yet, one of the Bf 109s he was dogfighting would hammer his right wing, causing him to gradually lose control of his plane. Noticing he was surrounded by British citizens and a population, knowing he could bail out, his crippled Hurricane would probably head directly for them. So he made a quick decision and decided he was going to take the bird in himself. Just pray to God he didn't die. Finding a small field near Hawkhurst, Millington would slam into the ground, almost rolling his plane. Badly burned and breaking multiple bones, Millington was alive. Taking 2 weeks for recovery, he would be moved to defend the city of London as it was in the middle of their blitz. After downing 2 more aircraft near London on the 27th of September, Millington would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Australian was now a legend in London, and he would spend the remainder of the battle in London fighting over the city. On the 30th of October, the day of the last battle, Millington would scramble to his Hurricane as over 100 aircraft were being reported heading over the channel. As he and his fellow pilots raced across the channel to meet their enemy, they would meet in a spectacular fashion of dogfighting and burning planes. Millington was last seen chasing a Bf 109 east across the channel, and he is the last Australian considered killed in the Battle of Britain. It will never be known if he successfully downed his 10th target. He was 23 years old. Born on September 30th, 1917 in Prestwich, Lancashire, Peter Malcolm Brothers had taken a keen interest in flying from an early age, becoming a pilot at the age of 16 in 1933. And after graduating from North Manchester School, Peter would take a short commission. Hey, there it is again. Take a short commission in January of 1936, and he officially became a probationary pilot that October. It would be another year before he would be granted status as a flying officer in the Royal Air Force in October of 1938. Once the war began, Brothers was now the flight commander over the 32nd Squadron in Biggin Hill. Flying a Hurricane during the Battle of Britain, Brothers would become a household name, especially in the city of London. The 32nd Squadron would be tasked with protecting the city of London during the early stages of the battle and leading towards the Blitz. It was during this time that Brothers would receive a warning of 100 bombers heading towards the city of London. Grabbing his pilots and scrambling to the air as fast as he could, he and his 11 other men would find themselves up against an armada of aircraft. Making a choice to engage, Brothers and his squadron dove onto the bombers and a massive dogfight began. As he began his attack, he would have a company as a pack of ME-110s would begin their hunt on Brothers as the lead plane. Taking evasive action and heading into an unrestricted climb, Brothers would stall his plane before spinning back to the earth, pulling out and evading his attackers. But Brothers would be unbothered and instantly began his own attack on an unsuspecting group of planes. By the time the fighting was complete, Brothers had not only avoided his own death, but he came back with a vengeance and destroyed 8 enemy aircraft, making him the coveted ace in a day. This would earn Brothers a Distinguished Flying Cross, and Brothers would go on to continue to lead the 32nd until he was one of 2 original pilots left, which would be promoted many times and moved throughout Europe. He would also continue to fly and knock down multiple Luftwaffe planes, to where he would eventually rise to the rank of Air Commodore and retire from the Royal Air Force in 1973 after 35 years of service. You're probably doing that math. He had a 2-year break from 1947 to 1949. He was in service from beginning to end. It was 37 years, but he had a 2-year break, right? So 35 years. Anyway, Sir Peter Brothers would die peacefully at his home on October 18th, 2008. He was 91 years old. Now, so far, I've done a lot of talking about British-born pilots in the RAF during this time. Well, that's because we're talking about the Battle of Britain, and in this episode, we're talking about the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom. It makes sense that we're talking about British-born pilots, but if you remember correctly, it was a melting pot of pilots. There were more than just British-born pilots there, right? Hundreds of men from 16 nations from around the world came to England to fight. And these are young dudes. These are not old guys, right? The average age of a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain was only 20 years old. As we're going to find out with our first foreign fighter, that not all men are built the same. Born on October 7th, 1914, in Austerlitz, Austria-Hungary, Joseph František would see the first-hand aftermath of the First World War. The son of a carpenter, young Joseph did not have financial stability to send him to a great prestigious school in Europe, and by an early age, he would leave school behind and become an apprentice locksmith. During this time, Joseph would be fascinated with aircraft and aviation. Quite literally, it was a height that he never really imagined he could reach. And that was until 1934, age of 20, that Joseph would move to Czechoslovakia, which is the ethnic home of his family, and to join the Czech Air Force as a trainee pilot. Joseph would graduate, and by 1936, he was a corporal. Yeah, he's enlisted, right? So enlisted men flew in other nations' air force. I know it's kind of weird to think about in today's time. However, there were nations during World War II that their pilots were enlisted. And this was not just an officer thing, right? So I know for a fact that the Germans, the Canadians, and even early on in the war, the Americans are using enlisted pilots, right? But anyway, 1936, he's a corporal flying reconnaissance biplanes. And Joseph proved every single time that he got into a cockpit that he was a natural born pilot that was incredibly proficient behind the controls. By 1937, he was promoted to sergeant and would begin to take on a leader-like capacity as an NCO. So it sounds like this is a fantastic guy to have on your side. And while there's a lot of greatness here, Joseph was a bit of a rule breaker, right? So fist fighting, drinking, a general lack of just not caring about the rules that the Air Force enforced. Joseph was in trouble quite a bit. And he even got to the point to where he was considered for a dishonorable discharge from the Czech Air Force. But you think about the time, right? It's an ever-changing landscape for Europe. They cannot let an experienced and skilled pilot go, so they keep him. As a punishment, Joseph would be transferred back to a training squadron, not to teach, but he would be taken as a student, and this time he would be in fighter planes. Once the Germans occupied Bohemia and Moravia, the Czech military was forced to dissolve, and many of their members were taken prisoner. However, Joseph and many other pilots would escape the occupied zone into Poland. From there, Joseph and the pilots would be given an offer. They could attempt passage through France onto a steamship and then to England to join the RAF, or they could stay in Poland and take a commission within the Polish Air Force. Now, it was during this time that Joseph would get shot down and wounded, and the Poles would fall. And again, the Czech pilot was on the run. From here, he would join the Free Polish Air Force out of Beirut, Lebanon. Beirut at this time is under French control. That's important to know here. And so when he goes to Beirut, he begins flying for the French Air Force or under the command of the French Air Force. It is here that he would get back into the seat of a fighter and be credited with his first victory. There's a little bit of debate on his story in the French Air Force, right? Some sources state that he was a mechanic learning how to fly the French aircraft, and he was kind of learning on the go, and he never went up in the skies and fought and flew in combat. There's other cases that talk about that he did go up and fly in combat. And of those that said that he did go fly in combat, state that he is credited with 11 victories. Regardless, if we look at his previous flying history and afterwards, once we hear what he does, I tend to firmly believe that he did, in fact, fly during that time and did down those aircraft. But as we all know, France would fall in 1940, and Joseph would once again be on the run, but this time he would only have one option, right? So he arrived in England, and he would be immediately attached to the 303rd Squadron of the Polish Air Force, who is now serving under the Royal Air Force. So at this point, he's fought in 4 different militaries within a very short amount of time. There's a lot going on in this dude's life. And Yosef was kind of considered a problem child to the RAF. While he was an incredibly skilled and deadly pilot, to the RAF, he was also a liability. In many instances, he would push his Hurricane beyond the limits it was designed for and would, at all costs, destroy his enemy. And that even meant if he needed to make forced landings. And during the Battle of Britain, Joseph would be quick to get his first victory within the unit on September 2nd, shooting down a Bf 109. Within 4 days, he would rack up an additional 4 victories near Kent, but the RAF wanted him to move, so they asked him to rejoin the Czechs, and he certainly told them no, and that he would be staying with his Polish comrades. Since it appeared that Joseph was too valuable of a pilot and he was dead set on fighting his own war, a compromise was reached when they allotted Joseph a spare Hurricane to basically come and go as he pleased. September of 1940 proved to be the month that Joseph was born for. Over the course of 28 days, he would be credited with 17 victories over London, and King George VI would award Joseph with the Distinguished Flying Medal. But Joseph's time and disorder would unfortunately catch up to him. On the 8th of October, 22 days before the end of the battle, Joseph's plane would crash unexpectedly in Surrey, killing the pilot immediately. While there are arguments of if Joseph lost control or if he was doing stunts in his plane for his girlfriend that lived in the city, we'll never know. He was 26 years old. Before we get to our last individual that I'd like to speak about to, give you a concept of what these guys were going through. Before we tie up the experiences of the Royal Air Force during this battle, we are going to talk about one more absolutely spectacular human being and airman. Born on the 3rd of October 1910 in Wellington, Cape Province, South Africa, Adolf Gijsbert Milan was born to a Dutch Huguenot family. Unlike the rest of the folks that we've talked about in this episode, Milan did not originally have his eye on the Air Force. In 1924, at the age of 14, Milan joined the South African Navy as a Navy cadet aboard the General Botha. Spending 4 years as a cadet, at the age of 18, he was reclassified as a naval officer cadet. He spent an incredible amount of time serving aboard the Lansdowne Castle before in February of 1932, my bad, February of 1932, at the age of 22, he would join the Royal Navy Reserve, where he was commissioned on June 18th, 1935. So, right, it's a long slog of a progress, right? He begins this in 1924. In 1935, he is commissioned as an officer in the Royal Navy. So where does he become a pilot, right? Well, in 1935, as a response to the Luftwaffe being created, the RAF was expanded. Now, remember, we talked about that in the last episode with Lord Stanley, right? He secretly expanded the Royal Air Force. And the Royal Air Force asked for volunteers from all branches of service to attend flight training. Milan, never having flown before, thought it might be a good time and raised his hand to volunteer. In December of 1936, He had earned his wings, and within 4 years, he would receive 4 promotions, finally achieving flight lieutenant 6 months before the outbreak of the war. Now, unlike the other pilots in this episode, Milan would have extensive service fighting against the Luftwaffe prior to the Battle of Britain. On May 28th, 1940, the 74th Squadron would scramble to head across the English Channel to assist the evacuation of Dunkirk, as there were now reports of Luftwaffe pilots strafing the beaches. Upon arrival, Milan would quickly get to work by downing 5 enemy aircraft along the French coastline, earning him his first Distinguished Flying Cross. A month later, on the 20th of June, he flew a night sortie against 2 HE-111s and downed both of them as well. What makes Milan so unique is, instead of being a student of combat flying, he was an innovator and a teacher. He not only established the 10 rules of fighter piloting, but he also was changing the way the British would fly in combat to be safer, yet more deadly. How good of a pilot was he? Well, the Luftwaffe had a lot of really great fighter pilots, and they basically had, if you will, a super ace, right? These incredibly never before seen numbers of victories. I mean, these are aces, you know, 10, 12, 14 times over. One of those individuals would be a gentleman by the name of Werner Mulders, who was the first fighter pilot in history with over 100 air victories, right? This dude is deadly, and everyone knows it. He was almost taken out of the war in 1940 by Milan. Now, there's debate on that, but we're going with it for this episode. And on August 8th, a month after the Battle of Britain started, Milan, who was now going by the name of Sailor by his men, a little bit of a paying homage to his Navy background, if you will, was again promoted to be a flight commander and stay with the 74th Squadron. On August 11th, just 3 days after taking command, he would scramble his men to intercept a bombing raid over Dover. Multiple times, the men of the 74th would land, refuel, and take back off as wave after wave of bombers kept hitting. The men led by Milan would hit them over and over and over again for nearly 16 hours. When the men landed and their claims came in for downed enemy aircraft, the 74th Squadron had an astonishing and never heard of before 38 downed enemy aircraft on the board, and this earned Milan his second Distinguished Flying Cross. For the remainder of the Battle of Britain, the 74th, led by Milan, would rule the skies in which they fought. And it was clear that Milan was destined for more than just a cockpit, and he is appointed as a wing leader the following March. He would go on to earn 2 Distinguished Service Orders. And Milan would become one of the greatest heroes of the Battle of Britain, and in all, one of the greatest heroes of the Royal Air Force. At the end of his own flying career in 1941, right? So this guy basically flew, I believe it was 14 months total in combat. So in 14 months of combat, he would have 27 confirmed victories to his name, making him England's leading ace up to that point. He would retire in 1946, but not before taking a stance against apartheid systems in South Africa, championing freedom for all sovereign peoples. However, the great hero would be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and it would take his life at the age of 53. I wanted to finish the stories with him because it is the memory of him that grabs my attention so much. A man that served with unbelievable dedication to service, one of the greatest fighter pilots ever to live. He was not given a military funeral. Comrades that had flown with him were barred from wearing their military uniforms to his funeral. And the South African Air Force was not allowed to do a ceremonial flyover. And this was all due to his opposition to the apartheid systems in South Africa. And it was a legacy never to be remembered. In all, the Battle of Britain for the Royal Air Force proved to be the moment in which they needed to arise to the occasion. If there's anything that we've learned from this episode, it was not the organization itself that arose, it was the men in the seats. It was the 20-year-old who knew that he was the last line of defense. was the foreign fighter that knew he would be fighting sooner rather than later. Or it was those that had been fighting for years and wanted to keep fighting. It was the constant up and downs of flying in and out of sorties all day long. For 3 months and 3 weeks, the RAF fought like hell, their backs against the wall, giving it everything they had to fight against the Luftwaffe to prevent the impending invasion from the east. 554 air crews serving in the RAF would give their lives during this time, with an additional 422 wounded. Nearly 1,000 casualties in just 3 months, and that was just from the air. It was a constant fight day and night, and the British Royal Air Force gave everyone exactly what they needed to know. They could 100% take on Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. As Winston Churchill stated after the battle, never in a field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. To end this episode, we raise our glasses to every pilot, mechanic, navigator, planner, co pilot, everyone in between that got these men into the air every day. To the few. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode as much as I have. I truly feel like I could have went on and on, as some of these stories are out of this world and they almost seem like they're made for movies. The heroics and the destruction these men faced in that 3-month period can truly never be forgotten. In our next episode of this series, we're going to be discussing quite the opposite of this one. No, I'm not going to be talking about the Luftwaffe, not yet. But we're going to be talking about the everyday civilians that were on the ground, those that were in the factories, the children going to school, those who fled, and those who stayed. We're going to be discussing and sharing the lives of all of these people and the impact that it had just not on England's survival during this time, but the impact that it had on their total victory. Thank you all so much for listening. Please make sure you give us a rating and review wherever you listen to this podcast. Head over to Patreon, Discord, and all of the social media platforms by searching World on Fire Podcast. We have a ton of exciting things come up. And if you're a local Hoosier in the state of Indiana, I am working on with a local organization to set up a massive event for the 80th anniversary of D-Day this summer. We should have veterans roundtables, kids learning events, reading lists, conversations, and physical events you can quite literally come and touch, right? It's good stuff that we all love. And hey, I'll be there too, right? So make sure you are following us to get the most up to date information. In the meantime, from now until our next episode, make sure you go on over to Kickstarter and order you a game for your fantastic friends, right? Our buddies over at Might and Fury World War II. Learn something great, go do something, go achieve something. Hey, if you want a little insight on the next episode, why don't you go read The Splendid and the Vile? And I'm going to see you all in 2 weeks.